Hello everyone, my name is Laiba. I'm so excited to be here today because it's our first day of our podcast creation. You know what is even more exciting? This podcast was created by youths for youths. And so we will be the voices of wisdom you'll hear every week for a total of 6 episodes. Now, today I have with me my co-host Dory. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Dory. I am a LaSalle youth and part of the podcast. Welcome to all our listeners. Our MCRE Youth Podcast title is Making a Change Requires Everyone. For short, we can say MCRE.
Many of us from visible minority and mostly Anglophone background are not always heard or seen in Quebec. In fact, we feel invisible in Quebec. It's like we don't even exist. Only when something like crime happens, we don't get a chance to be represented in a positive way. So we are excited to have this opportunity to voice our opinions in such a public forum and to tell everyone that our needs are important.
We started this podcast as a crime prevention venture with the aim of bringing awareness to experience our visible minority youth. We can share our thoughts and feelings in a safe space, while at the same time bring awareness to some of the social problems that place us at risk for crime.
Yes, we want this podcast to be empowering, to feel that people can listen to our stories that shape our lives and our experiences as marginalized youths. In Montreal, gun violence, hate crime have increased rapidly after the pandemic. Dozens of young people have been engulfed in a relentless violence aggravated by the pandemic. 5 minors between the ages of 15 and 17 died in a violent incident between February 7, 2021 and February 8, 2022. Countless more were injured in incidents across the city this year, including a 15-year-old stabbed in Hochelaga Maisonneuve and a 16-year-old shot in Ahuntsic in April. And we see many domestic violence as well.
We know that Montreal is not nearly as violent as other North American cities. Toronto, by comparison, has roughly doubled our homicide rate. However, while Montreal is safer, the incidence of crime and gun violence has rapidly increased, and a measure of concern.
It's true. We see the traditional response to armed violence in Quebec was to call for more law enforcement and tougher sentences for criminals, hoping that putting people in prison would solve the problem. And this resulting in an overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous youths in the prison system. But does this solve the problem? No.
I agree. Look at the literature. We have been doing this for generations with no progress. We need to stop looking at the issue of crime and violence in Montreal in isolation. But people of color is visibly minority statured. They experience systematic racism, inclusion, discrimination, unequal access to our opportunities, and lack of justice are all connected to risk factors of crime.
I hear you loud and clear. For sure, gun violence and crime will not be reduced by focusing solely on police and prisons. These issues are linked to unresolved traumas, including systemic barrier, inequality, racism, and adverse childhood experiences. Our law enforcement and elected officials and policymakers need to go back to understanding grassroots connections with the community and be responsive and transparent in dealing with our communities to build trust. Let's get something straight here. Minority population are disproportionately exposed to disadvantaged socioeconomic conditions such as concentrated poverty, racism, limited access to education, and job opportunities, placing us at risk to violence. I think there needs to be a combined effort of policing and prevention community programs like this one. While we welcome the traditional method of understanding this problem, we know from our experience as marginalized youths that there are social problems that lead to youth vulnerability and risk to crime that are often overlooked by policymakers and those in decision positions. So in this podcast, we will be addressing issues that affect us and place us at risk as racialized youths to crime and violence.
Right. So in this podcast, we'll be addressing issues such as mental health issues caused by chronic exposure to racism, inclusion of LGBTQ issues, and the overrepresentation of racialized children in special education schools. The lack of proper housing, the high unemployment rate among visible minority youth, you know the old saying, there is nothing stopping a bullet like a job. So access to jobs and seeing ourselves as minorities represented in decision-making jobs will also be addressed. We'll interview several guests from the police, fire department, city councils, school teachers, and principals to examine the increase in crime in context of many social issues affecting minority communities in Montreal.
So this brings us to end of this segment. Wow, how time flies when you have a lot to say. I want to thank my co-host Dory for joining me here today in this stimulating introduction of our podcast. As discussed, we will be addressing all of this in the coming weeks in our podcast episodes, and we will be interviewing key people with the intentions of bringing awareness and change. Remember, we cannot do this alone. We need everybody on board. And as is the title of this podcast, making changes require everyone. If you enjoy our show, please rate us and review us on Apple Podcast, and be sure to come back next week for more exciting, knowledge-changing, frank-speaking discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
MCRE, making change requires everyone. See you on the next episode.